Worship. We are going to come to the conclusion of David's life today. So sad. That means I'll have to pick up with Solomon next year. But for those of you that have been in attendance, we've been covering David for the last 5 weeks. And we started that series a couple years ago, got him to the throne, and now we're kind of where we're at. And I'm going to try to do a synopsis of this entire series real quick, and we're going to cover a lot of ground. This would be pen and paper out because I'm going to have to summarize large segments of time, and so if I can only preach it so fast, and you got to be able to handle it. And so today I'm going to bring the heat. Okay, so I hope you're ready for some church today. You guys ready for some church today? Some of you aren't ready. You're not ready. It doesn't matter if you think you're ready. You're not. And so I'm going to start off by just saying it's complicated. All right, it's complicated. It's complicated. We tend to want things to be like they fit in a little box and it's nice and tidy, but it's complicated. And I think the way that I can illustrate it is that, when a situation happens to you, then you kind of have a way that you want to deal with that. But if someone were to ask you for advice on the same situation, you can stand outside yourself and you can give crystal clear advice to them, because to you, not knowing all the nuances of the situation, you'd say, oh, well, that's really clear. This is obviously how you should handle that. But if you were now in the same situation and now you realize there's so much nuance and complexity, and let's just say it's your kid. It's your kid, and someone else's kid, you're just like, oh, beat them, ground them, take things away. And it's easy for you to say that about someone else's kid on how to handle that situation, right? You're at the playground, you see that kid, you're in the classroom, you're like, oh, this needs to happen. But then when you find out there's other things, right? Maybe there's some other things. Maybe there's some love that's lacking. Maybe there's a broken home situation. Maybe there's an attention issue. Maybe there's a disorder that you see. All of a sudden now, what was so simple, right? It becomes complicated. And I think that what we're going to see today in David's life is that, man, there was a lot of complicated. There was a lot of complicated. David was called when he was just a boy to become a king. What kind of pressure is that? David, this man named Samuel, comes to his house, and they bring in the oldest son, and the oldest son, he is much like my physique. He was tall, dark, and handsome, and built like a truck. And David was like, Samuel was like, this must be him. This must be him. Jesse, his father, was like, I'm going to tell you, of all my kids, this guy right here, he could throw a football a country mile. He's strong as an ox. And so he thought it was him. And then Samuel, God had to tap him on the shoulder and it's like, no, that's not him. That's not him. And he parades the rest of his sons. I believe he had 7 other sons. And God was like, no. And then it was like David, an afterthought, out there taking care of the sheep, smells like he's taking care of sheep. And they're like, well, we only got one left. And so bottom of the barrel is what Jesse thought about David. And I'm not saying he didn't love him. It's just like, you look at some of your kids, they're like, they're not king material. And so they bring in David, and when Samuel sees him, he's like, that's the one. And they're like, what? David? They're like, all the older brothers, slapping him on the head, like this guy. And he pulls out this horn of oil, and in the Old Testament, the horn of oil was like the Holy Spirit, and you had to be anointed. So they would pour the horn of oil on the head, and it would flow all the way down the beard, and that would be a sign that God was going to be upon this person. And so David then rises up to the moment that he takes on Goliath out there in the valley. Here is this Philistine standing 10 foot tall, and he's able to take him out with one stone. And then he rises to Saul's house, and he's over there getting down, playing a harp like Jimi Hendrix. You know what I'm saying? He's like, he is getting after it, okay? And the next thing you know, Saul is chunking spears at David's head, and he's dodging. He's like, what is going on? I just killed a giant for you, and now you're trying to kill me. And he has to go on the run for 14 years, and it's complicated. Don't you think, if you killed a giant, the story should go, and next he was promoted to king, and he lived happily ever after. But it doesn't go like that. It's complicated. It's So complicated. And then he eventually rises to the southern kingdom of power, and he's trying to consolidate power. Saul is mortally wounded in a battle, and rather than have the enemy tear his body apart, he falls on his own sword, and so now Saul is dead, and David is king of the southern kingdom, and his general that we talked about in week 1, Abner, decides he wants to do God's will and put the kingdom together. He goes down, negotiates it with David, and they have a talk, and they're like, okay, we're going to put the kingdom together. And as Abner is returning home to finalize the details, Joab, David's general, kills Abner. He's like, no, we're not going to let this man into our territory. And David's like, what are you doing? What are you doing? We just had all the details worked out. Have you ever had a person do that? Like you put together a deal painstakingly and then like their big mouth just blows it all up. Anybody in here? Like, gosh, like shut up, all right? And so here you are with Abner is now dead because Joab, we talked about, had an axe to grind because Asahel was his brother and he was really fast and he chased Abner, and Abner was like, hey, you don't want this and you better quit chasing me, and he didn't quit chasing him. And so we talked about, be careful what you're chasing, and because Abner turned around, he killed Asahel. So Joab had an axe to grind with Abner because of what he did to Asahel, and so Joab is David's right-hand man, and he kills Abner, and now David's got to put this, and he commits a curse to Joab. He says, a pox be on your house. For the rest of your lineage, you will not have someone who's not without sickness or physical deformity, because you took an innocent man's life. And so the kingdom is now put together, and everything is great. David's on the throne, and 2 weeks ago we discussed that one moment, that one look. David sees Bathsheba, and in one uncontrolled glance, it leads to an unrestrained action, and David throws a lot of his goodness away, makes a terrible mistake, a mistake that is now going to haunt him through the ramifications for the rest of his days. And today we're going to talk about some of those ramifications. Man, it's complicated. Because we would love to be king. Everyone in here, like you dream of like you want to be king. Like, oh, if I was king. Listen. You wouldn't be a good king. You wouldn't be. You're just not cut out for it, all right? The higher you go up, the greater the accountability. The higher you go up, whenever there's a problem, there isn't like, okay, when you're down here at the lowest level, you could talk to anybody. But the higher you go up, there's less people to talk to because people haven't been to where you now are. So who are you going to ask what to do? Who's going to tell you? Who's going to tell Michael Jordan how to get better, Michael Jordan? It's hard to tell Michael Jordan. He's at the top. David is now at the top. It's just hard. The higher you go up in spiritual growth, the higher the accountability. And we're going to see the accountability for David's sin was so great. The cost was so great because he had risen so high. Just imagine what it's like to be king or to be pastor. Imagine what it's like to be pastor of you people. Like, imagine what that's like, right? Like, imagine how complicated it is. Like how you feel about me and how we should act together and dance this dance. I mean, I got recovering Baptist in here, right? You understand? Like, I got some people in here that if I don't tell them how sorry a sinner they are and slap them across the face and spit on them a little bit, they don't feel like they went to church, all right? They need that. They're like, that's a good sermon today. He hammered me, all right? And then I got Methodists in here, and they're like, just tell us you love us, please, pat us on the back. We're all good. We're all okay. You understand it's complicated. It's complicated. I got people who are like, oh, he needs to feed the sheep. I don't feel like I'm getting fed. Listen, punk. I'm going to tell you. My job as the shepherd is not to feed you. It is to take you to where the good grass is, and then you got to put your head down there, and you got to eat it. But the shepherd doesn't pick the grass up and stick it in the sheep. No, that's not what a shepherd does. So some of you wouldn't be able to be pastor. Some of you sitting out there, I could be a pastor. They just work one day. No. No, that's not what we do. Like, what do pastors do anyway? We put up with you. That's what we do. It's complicated. It's complicated. Everybody's at every different level. And you don't stay at the same level. It's not like once we get you good, you stay there. No, you find your way into some other kind of sin. And who do you listen to? Like, you listen to Jerry at the office for marriage advice. Is he a pastor? Is he a man of God? Is he qualified to counsel you? Is his marriage good? No. Jerry's on the verge of divorce. He's probably on his third marriage. He's probably cheated on his first two wives. And I got to compete with Jerry. Are you hearing? Like, you won't ask me, but you'll ask Jerry. What kind of, oh my gosh. What do you think? Where should I go to church? Who are you listening to? Who are you listening? I mean, come on. At some point, it's complicated because we complicate it. It's complicated because you aren't going to God for wisdom. And then after you go to God, you got to make sure you got godly people, and not just in name, but you got to look at what they're producing. Do they have the fruit that represents the root that is God in their life? Don't tell me they go to church. You all go to church. That doesn't mean anything. So we're going to begin today in a proverb written by Solomon about his dad. And then I'm going to go through all the rest that his dad went through, and I hope that it resonates with you throughout this sermon what Solomon was hearing when his dad said this. Because I think that most of us in here will agree that our children will be our best or worst sermons. And you want to get that one right. You want to get that sermon right. You might make some mistakes in a lot of areas, and you're not going to win them all. David certainly didn't. But when it comes to the arrow and how you aim it, boy, you want to get that one right. And the church said, yeah. Proverbs chapter 4. When I was a son with my father, tender and precious to my mother. Which, by the way, just for context, he's talking about Bathsheba. This is her only son. He taught me and said, your heart must hold on to my words. Keep my commands and live. Get wisdom, get understanding. Don't forget or turn away from the words of my mouth. Don't abandon wisdom, and she will watch over you. Love her, and she will guard you. Wisdom is supreme, so get wisdom. And whatever else you get understanding. Really simple, really simple. Wisdom. Wisdom. Wisdom is for the things that you don't know. Because there's going to be some areas that get super complicated in your life. And if you don't have wisdom, you'll go with what you feel. And we'll see in David's story that he had to go against what he felt many, many times. Because the higher you go, the greater the consequences of getting it wrong. The more people that are relying on you to get it right. So I want you to know that if you don't have wisdom, you're going to get yourself in a complicated situation, and you're going to go with your gut, and your gut has a sin nature inside of it that is just dying to get out, and you're going to blow it. You're going to make a terrible mistake. So wisdom is going to guide us when we don't know what to do. When there are things that we can't even know. Wisdom is where we ultimately need to land. So David is on the throne. He's committed sin. He's confessed the sin. He's been restored. And the child that Bathsheba had, out of the result of the sin, died because of David's sin. And so David buries child number 1. Next, as everything begins to grow around him, David had a son named Amnon. And you don't know the name Amnon for a reason. Amnon decided that he loved his half-sister, Tamar. And I know we're all thinking like Arkansas hillbilly deliverance, right? I know. Ding, 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 ding. Anyway, and the only person I ever know that married a cousin was a Texan, so they're everywhere, is what I'm saying. And he was a preacher. That's weird. Okay, he's not a preacher anymore. But anyway, some crazy stories, man. It's complicated. You think it's not complicated? I got to tell this stuff. Anyway, Amnon thought he loved his sister, but sometimes we say love when we mean what? Yeah. Isn't it weird how we can redefine the term to try to justify our actions, and we can say love, but we really don't mean love. We mean love. We mean I want to get what I want. But baby, I love you. But baby, I love you. Or I love you. I love this. I love that. I love this company. No, you don't. No, you don't. You're thinking about what's best for you. He takes Tamar and deceives her, and she even says, hey, if you will just ask David, we'll get married, we'll do this right. And he refuses, and he rapes her. It says after he raped her, verse 15, then Amnon hated her. Next verse. With an intense hatred. In fact, he hated her more than he loved her. Amnon said to her, get up and get out. Sexual sin will never satisfy what your soul needs. Sexual sin will never satisfy what your soul needs. It's weird how we take what God intends for good, and because we twist it, we taint it, and we allow our sin nature to interact with it, and then it turns into something different. But God created sex to be good. He created a man. And then he took a rib from a man, he created a woman. And then God instituted the concept of marriage between a husband and a wife, and he intended for them to enjoy that union at the highest level, and that is the circle of boundary that God placed upon marriage and intimacy. And every time we go outside of the boundaries that God has laid down, understand that sexual experience will never satisfy the inward part of your soul. You're trying to satisfy the sinful side of your flesh. And the flesh will always deceive you and lie to you and say, oh, if you could just have this, or if you could just have this. And what it wants you to have is right outside of the boundary that God put in place. And it lies to you. It says, when you get this new person, or if you do this new thing, or this new marriage, or this new job, or this new church, or this new whatever, it says, then you'll be satisfied. And every time you get that thing, like Amnon, guess what? Because you were seeking it out of selfish desire, it will never satisfy. Until your heart is right with God, there's no physical relationship that will bring you peace. As a matter of fact, until your relationship is right with God, you can't give what God intended for you to give in the marriage. He wanted you to give out of the abundance of His grace and love. And when you're not right with Him, you don't have anything to give. Amnon commits this sexual sin with Tamar, his half-sister, who had an older brother that was in line to be king after David. And his name was Abasalom. Abasalom, Tamar goes running to her brother. She's discarded. And in their culture, because of what had happened, she was now not a candidate for marriage, so she lived with the result of that sin for the rest of her life. And I just want to say, may God have mercy on anyone who has ever dealt or been a victim of sexual sin. I don't know, having done this many, many years, if you ever really get over it. You might learn to live with it, but I don't know that you get over it. Absalom tells Tamar, don't say a word to anyone. Don't say a word to anyone. But what do you think Absalom's thinking? He's thinking what you're thinking. I'm just going to wait. He waits 2 years. 2 years. And he throws a party. And guess who's invited? Amnon. And all the princes. Invited out to a little party, a little get-together. It's very much like The Sopranos. They get out to the party, and right at the crescendo of the party, Absalom rises up and he strikes Amnon down. And there's a part of me, I'm not going to lie, that's like, good on you. Good on. I mean, like, if it happened to your daughter, would there be an easy verdict? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Word gets back to David, but it doesn't, the telephone game, it doesn't get back precise, and it gets back to David that all the princes have been killed, and David is distraught. David is freaking out. And then they clear up the communication. They tell him, no, Absalom has killed Amnon. He's fled to his grandfather's house on his mother's side. And David now is mourning the loss of a second child. He now buries a second child. And now David is dealing with the loss of Absalom in his presence, even though Absalom has taken out his son. And somehow you have to love Amnon, even though he did this terrible thing. And now you have to figure out a way to love Absalom because they're your kids. Like you have to figure out a way to love them even when they do unlovable things. And the church said, amen, yeah, you have to. You have to. It's complicated, isn't it? It's complicated. Joab, David's right-hand man, the guy that killed Abner, he sees that his king is heartsick, and so he calls to this woman and he gives her a story, concocts a story to pull the heartstrings of David, to try to give David the peace of having his son come back out of exile. And so David capitulates, and it's hard to say. It's hard to say, was Joab doing a good thing or was Joab doing a bad? It's hard to say. It's complicated. He brings Absalom back, but he says you have to stay on house arrest. After a couple of years, he's allowed back in the court. And you would think that Absalom's response to a father, it's almost like you want it to be the prodigal son, right? You want it to be like, oh my gosh. Like the son comes home and he runs into the father's arms and his son loves him because he forgives him and he understands you had to kill Amnon because what he did to your sister. But what if I told you that Absalom, yeah, he killed Amnon maybe for justice, but what if I told you he was always plotting to get the throne? That he had his eyes set on the throne the whole time. And after David brought him back, instead of rewarding his dad for the grace that he has given, for 4 years, he went around, and anybody that had a dispute, he would help them with their dispute. And when they went to bow before him, he grabbed them and kissed them on the face. And it says that he stole the hearts of Israel. Do you think that everybody that compliments you has your best interest in mind? Are you in fact that awesome? Do you believe that? Do you believe that? You are crazy if you believe when someone is buttering you up, you better watch out. You better watch out. I mean, they're not trying to help you. They're not trying to help you. Absalom pulls some people to his side and declares himself king, while David is still on the throne. Now, David has to make a decision. Do I stay and fight my son? let's go back to the scoreboard. Has David ever been defeated? No. Spoiler, will David ever be defeated? No. So David has to make a decision. Boy, that's complicated. Do I stay and fight and kill my son, or do I flee and abdicate my throne? You better have wisdom. You better have wisdom. David decides to flee. He gets up and he leaves. And his consortium goes with him. And he begins walking out. And he's weeping while he's walking. You want to be king, right? He's weeping while he's walking. And he's learning over and over again that you have to have wisdom to trust God. Wisdom to trust God. Because I had no idea this was going to happen. I have to have wisdom right now to trust God. And that God knows what I need. Do you understand like God knows what you need? This guy named Ziba, okay, not to be confused with the seltzer Zima, okay, of the 80s. Anybody? Okay, thank you. I see those hands. Ziba, this guy named Ziba shows up as David is fleeing, and he's got bread, wine, and refreshments. I mean, he's got a charcuterie board. He's like, hey. Like, now you say to yourself, why, Tim, are you telling me about Ziba, the guy who shows up? Because it's important that you understand how Ziba was there. When David got installed as king, the first thing that he did was he said, is there anybody from Saul's house left? Specifically, is there anyone from Jonathan's house left? And they said, there's one guy, his name is Mephibosheth. He's crippled. His caretaker dropped him and he broke both of his feet and he can't walk. And so he had two things going against him. He was crippled, which in their culture meant that you didn't count for anything. And then secondly, he was from the house of Saul. And when you took the throne, you wiped out all the other descendants because you didn't want someone to have an uprising against you. So the easiest way to do is take them all out. First thing David does, is there a person from Jonathan's house still alive? One, Mephibosheth. Bring him to my table. And for the rest of his life, he'll eat at my table. Now, if you're one of David's counterparts, if you're Joab, you have to say, like, what are you doing? Why would you keep your enemy alive? Hey, it's complicated. He had made a promise to Jonathan. And now David was keeping his promise by keeping Mephibosheth alive. You see, there's like black and white and what looks like it's clear cut, wipe them all out. But then whenever you follow after God, you got to give space for grace. You got, like, even when wisdom will tell you to do things that make no sense today, but understand it's complicated, yet it's connected. And what you do today is a seed that you're planting that is going to affect tomorrow. Guess who Mephibosheth's servant was? Ziba. Ziba. If David doesn't keep Mephibosheth alive, then Ziba isn't there all these years later with food and refreshments on your weakest, worst day while you're weeping, walking away from the throne that God gave you. Are you kidding me? You better have wisdom because you could take them out, but you might need someone later. And they're holding the key to your provision, and your decision today is going to affect your provision tomorrow. Are you hearing what I'm saying? Are you hearing it today? You might want to take your justice, but maybe you ought to give grace. Maybe you ought to plant some grace in the ground so that when you're at your weakest and you're weeping, God takes with the person that you should have taken out and delivers your blessing through your enemy's hands. Are you kidding me? That's crazy. You got to trust God. Wisdom to trust God. God knows what you need, and he also knows, secondly, he knows who you need. Boy, when you're going through something, you're going to need someone. Yes, we have the Lord, but we need people too. You need someone on your darkest day. And I'm going to tell you how good God is. Y'all get ready. Don't shout me down now. Don't shout me down. David is walking out. Ziba has already delivered the charcuterie. And then David has an exchange with a soldier he doesn't even know. And it's this guy named Ittai. And don't even look at me spiritual like you know who Ittai is. You don't even know who Ittai is. Let's all say his name on the count of three. 1, 2, 3. Ittai. Ittai. You're going to know Ittai's name today. David said to Ittai the Gittite. Now, it says Gittite there, but if you go read the whole context, it's actually Gittite, a Gadite. And I know you know Gadites are Philistines. So let's just say that Goliath was a Philistine. So what I'm saying is the guy that took their giant out and has subsequently slain their whole entire country, okay, that a guy has defected and is a mercenary under David's command, and his name is Ittai. Should be an enemy, should be. He said, why should you come along with us? Go back and stay with Absalom. You are a foreigner and exile from your homeland. It'll be easier for you. You have no allegiance to me. You stay where it's safe. Hey, the palace, it's got the pool, it's got everything, it's got the golf course. I mean, stay there with Absalom. This guy. Verse 20, he said, you came only yesterday. He ain't been around. He wasn't around. He came yesterday. And today, shall I make you wander about with us? How is David so to have the presence of mind while you're weeping and walking away, betrayed by your own son, to sit here and have a conversation with a guy you just met, considering his best interest, seemed like that's always David's way. Today shall I make you wander about with us? I do not know where I'm going. Go back and take your people with you. May the Lord show you kindness and faithfulness. Man, God, David's trying to bless him away. But Ittai replied, as surely as the Lord lives, and as my Lord the king lives, wherever my Lord the king may be, whether it means life or death, there will your servant be. Oh, sometimes we think serving isn't sexy, but when you hear Ittai say that, man, that sounds like somebody I want to be, right? Like, we don't talk like that, right? We don't talk like that. We don't say like, oh, Pastor Tim, you have planted this church, and no matter where you lead, I will follow, and if you die, I will die at your right hand. I am with you to the end. No, you're like, man, if you go too long, I'm going to watch the Cowboy game. I'm going to stay home. Weak is what most of us are. We don't talk like this. But on your worst day, God knows what you need, and he knows who you need. And all of a sudden, a guy named Ittai with 600 mercenaries from the guy that you took out, his champion, shows up at your door and pledges his fealty to you in its absolute supremacy. And David says, what's your name? Ittai. Do you know what Ittai means? Timely. Timely. On David's worst day, a dude shows up the day before who was part of his enemy's house, pledges his allegiance to David, and then David says, timely. You think that God doesn't know what you need? You think that God doesn't know who you need? Do you know that God is right on time today? You thought you walked in a sermon because someone else invited you? No, you came to get the full enchilada today at church. Yes. If I haven't got you yet, I am coming for you. You can put your head down, you can look in your phone, but somehow I will get you before the day is done. Listen to me. Timely. Just the message you need. How many times have you walked in here, it was just the song you needed? It was just the conversation that happened before you even got in the doors that you needed. It was just the student ministry when your kid was going the wrong way that you needed? Are you thanking God today that he knows what you need, he knows who you need, and he brings them at just the right time? David promotes Ittai. Just 2 chapters later, Absalom comes after David. It's time to fight. David refused to go to the fight. He tells Joab, we're going to divide the squadron into 3 groups. We're going to give one to Joab. We're going to give one to Benaniah, a proven warrior. And guess who gets the 3rd army? Ittai. It doesn't matter if you've been here 5 years or 5 minutes. Do you know what David was looking for? The right heart right now. That's what we can work with. It doesn't matter what you've done in the past. There is no seniority in the Christian complex. Do you know what we need? We need the right heart right now in Genesis Metro Church. It might be your first day that you walked in here, but guess what? I need you. We need you. Right heart right now. Man, I hope today we have an Ittai walking in at just the right time. Timely. Isn't it amazing that God just brings things that are timely? They go out to fight Absalom, and David says to the 3 generals, hey, if it's possible, don't hurt the boy. Don't hurt him. They get out there in the battle, and the old dogs, well, they whooped the young dogs. Absalom's men fled, and Absalom tried to get away. But he had this long hair. And the crazy thing is there was this low-hanging branch, and his hair got hung in the tree. And it yanked him off his horse so that he was suspended off the ground and couldn't get free. David's men come along, and now they see Absalom hanging there, defenseless, and they don't know what to do. They're like, we heard him say, don't hurt the boy. We heard him say, don't hurt the boy. And they went and got Joab. Joab comes in the situation. Joab does not hesitate. Joab takes 3 spears, and I don't know why he needed 3. Wham! Rams them into Absalom, kills him, and they cut him down. Dead. Word gets back to David. Absalom's dead. Child number 3. I can't imagine burying 1. And David weeps. He says, Absalom, Absalom, oh, that you had lived and that I had died. Joab is looking at his king and his leader, and he's like, what are you doing? Do you hear what you just did? Like, these men just went out there and laid it on the line, and now you are professing that you love the man who was trying to take you out, and you despise the soldiers who are fighting for you? Now, David, you get out there on your throne and you be the king we need you to be. And David summons all the strength that he has and walks out there to inspire the men. Joab, I got a question for you. It's complicated, isn't it? Is Joab his friend? Or is Joab his foe? Because Joab is doing terrible things on one end, and then he's giving David godly advice on the other side. What if I told you that wisdom will cause you to hold on when your feelings are saying let go? And that sometimes you have to hold on to your enemy even when your flesh wants to cut them loose. And sometimes your fate is in your enemy's hands, and it doesn't make any earthly sense, but wisdom tells you, hold on, even when you want to let go. You better listen to wisdom. You better listen to wisdom. Because Joab and the men go out to a battle a couple of chapters later. And it says that David grew weary in the middle of the battle. And one of the champions from the enemy saw David in his weakness and stepped forth to slay him. David was defenseless, and someone steps in. Abishai, Joab's brother, takes the enemy out. I'm talking razor, like the sword is coming down, and like Abishai just sticks his sword, blocks it, chops the head off, and glory, hallelujah. They look at David and they say, David, this is your last battle. You got too old. You're over the hill. We can't let the light of Israel go out. But let me ask you a question. If he had taken out Joab, would his brother Abishai have stayed with David? So you mean that his deliverance was in his enemy's hands? He kept by wisdom Joab, even though his feelings said he wanted to let him go. And it was because he kept him that he kept Abishai, and because he kept Abishai, he kept his life. God knows what you need. He knows who you need. But he also is going to give you wisdom at times that goes against everything you're thinking. It's going against everything you believe. When the woman is caught in adultery, Jesus says, let him who's without sin cast the first stone. You hear what I'm saying? Like, yeah, that seems black and white. That seems clear cut. It says she should be stoned to death. And yet Jesus says, but let's give space for grace. If you want it to be simple and simplistic, then you're not reading your Bible. It's complicated. It's complicated. One size does not fit all, does not fit every situation. And sometimes the wicked get a pass for a little while. Not forever, but for a little while. And sometimes it's wise for you to let them. You say, Tim, that didn't make any sense. I know. You want justice. It'll come. But not at your hand. Just let God deal with it. Just let God, you give space for grace. When we get to the men that are listed in David's Hall of Fame of Faith, there is little Ittai. Of all the thousands of soldiers that David commanded, Ittai made the list, 37. Ittai made the list, timely. Uriah, the Hittite, that David committed murder against, made the list. Asahel, Joab's older brother, made the list. Abishai, who protected David, made the list. Do you know who didn't make the list? Joab. Joab ultimately betrayed and ultimately was an enemy. But he wasn't always an enemy. And what I'm trying to say is people aren't static. They're going to be good and evil. And wisdom is going to tell you what you need to do. But if you think that all people are good all the time or all people are evil all the time, you're wrong on both. They usually are some good and some evil, and they bounce between the two. And wisdom is the only thing that you're going to have to tell you what to do. You better get wisdom because it's complicated. Let's pray. Father, we ask in the name of Jesus that you give us all wisdom, God. Wisdom to trust you when we've lost a child. Wisdom to trust you when we've been abused. Wisdom to trust that grace is better than condemnation. That mercy has triumphed over justice. And we all deserve condemnation for our sin, but you gave us a cross instead. God, I pray that we would receive mercy, that we would give mercy, and that, God, we would be wise. I pray, God, that you would raise up the Ittais in the room that you sent, and they think it's only yesterday. It's my first Sunday, but no, this is a moment that we need. We need people that are willing to commit, not to going to church, not to playing church, Lord, to doing church. And I pray that you would convict all of us, God, with Ittai's example, that you don't need more time to figure it out. If God is here, and this is where you're called, all in, all in, all in. I promise you, if you make that commitment, that when you see the end, it'll be worth all of the sacrifice. If God has been timely in your life, if he has sent you what you needed and who you needed, and saved you in ways that you couldn't possibly imagine, saved you indeed from yourself, then I believe a song of praise should be on our lips. We want to give you that opportunity right now. Would you stand and worship with us?